Hi there, hello and welcome. It's great to see you. My name's Lance. I'm a professional illustrator and teacher with years of experience. My goal with this channel is going to be making fun, properly scaffolded and easily followed videos, get anyone started, and take you further as an illustrator. To begin today, what I'm going to do is go through one simple illustration as a tutorial. We'll give a brief overview of each of the steps. We'll go all the way from the basic sketch to a final completed illustration. Now in future videos, I'm going to dig in and cover each of these steps in more depth as their own standalone videos. And I'll also cover other topics as well, like general lighting, anatomy, planning and skills development, how to give and receive effective and constructive feedback, and different illustration software and hardware you can use. Now, of course, if that sounds like something you want to see more of, then like and subscribe, but not right now. Watch the whole video, see if you like it, see if you like the vibe, and if you do, like and subscribe then if it's a cup of tea. So for today, the steps we're going to go over are, we'll look at the sketch and how to do proportions, we'll do inking, including how to add line weight, we'll go over flat colours, adding shading and blocking in and some detailing, as well as the details and highlights, also simple background detailing and some atmosphere. And then just very briefly we'll touch on some post-processing, like subsurface scattering, how to soften the line art, and adding a bit of a glow. Now I'm going to be using Clip Studio Paint, but all this will work in every other bit of software, like your Photoshop, your Paint Tool Sci, your Critter, your Procreate, etc. So let's begin. So to begin with, we're going to draw in the head, just as a basic ball, and put in a jawline and the eyeline. Now we'll tilt the eyeline up or down depending on the perspective. In this case, we're going from a view from below, so we're going to arc that line up. So I'll move on then to the rib cage and shoulders. The rib cage, I like to use a sort of an egg shape. It gives a nice sort of rounded feel to the construction, and it's not too sort of square and blocky. And adding the two balls on the side for the shoulders, and then you can see I've done the pelvis down the bottom, which I sort of do as a trapezoid shape with the corners rounded off. Now, it was coming off a bit off the frame there, so I pulled it up a little bit. So just fixing up some of those shapes after I've added the legs, and adding a little crease for where I'm planning to have some clothing later, and then now adding the limbs and adding the thickness. With the limbs, one easy way to get the thickness right is for the forearms, thighs, and calves, you'll have them get thicker for the first third of their length, and then they'll taper for the next 2/3. You can see there I've moved on to the face, just getting the basic shapes in, indenting the eyes in really far, and having those two lines that come out from the corner of the eyes to stick the eyebrows out, because they're not on the same surface plane. The eyes sit in, and the eyebrows sit out. So it's important to get that one right. And now just detailing, getting some of the rough shapes smoothed in for things like the shoulder, and adding in the hair and the big thing that sticks on top of the hair. I think it's a hoge, and just fixing up that jawline there, adding a bit of detail in for like a hat. I was thinking like a beret for that, and I'll come back to that later. Adding a bit of just basic framing of some hair to soften the lines of the face. Fixing up the lines of the leg there and the pelvis. And now, just doing in some sketching for the basic background. This is just some lines to show where the perspective's going to be, essentially. So this will tell me where it leads up. So again, just like how we've drawn the head from below, we're going to draw the background from below as well. So that's going to let us set our frame. Now I've got those details in. I've paled all the sketch now, and from here I'll be doing a second go over of the sketch. Now this one's just to sort of refine the shape, make sure all the information that I'm going to need for the inking step is in there, so I won't be inking blind. Like every bit of detail I'll be going over is at least counted off. I won't have an unfinished portion, an undrawn hand, or no section of hair to explain what I'm doing with the inking. So this one can still be pretty rough. I just need the information to be there. And so I'll do things like feathering out the hair, or adding some clothing details, adding detail to the ears, and also deciding on some of the details for clothing. So you can see there I added a little bit of a collar for the sort of turtleneck, but I'm also doing cut-off sleeves to show the robot parts of this character. And so with robot parts, like a lot of different things, you're better off not doing detailing everywhere. Give the viewer some rest breaks. So I'll only really add sort of robotic detail or any real detail around certain points, and I'll leave other big areas blank, or at least less detailed. So there's like a rest area for the viewer. So there's still contrast between the detailed parts and the non-detailed parts. Because if you have detail everywhere, you'll end up with sort of a Where's Wally, and where everything will be so drowned in detail, it just becomes noise. And so here you can see I'm going over the arms, and those little notches, those little lines up above it I'm drawing there, that's me marking out the third line, so I can have the forearm thicken for about a third of its length and then taper in. And then just adding the detail for the hands. Now, one other thing with things like hands and the face, those ones, even if they're really far from the frame, so the hands here aren't even, they're in the bottom 10% of the frame, they still need to be right. Hands and faces will draw a lot of attention from the viewer, so they need to be right, even if they're not in a focal position. They're a point where the viewer will be drawn, so they need to be fairly well on. So you can pop detail on them and just make sure they're right. Use your own hand as a reference if you want. If you're right-handed, you've got a left-handed reference right there with you, and if you need a right-handed reference, just flip the canvas. So I did some quick sketching out there for the hair, and that looks okay. And I'm doing another second sketch over of the background, just get those shapes in there. Now I've done this one a separate color just to visually separate it out for myself, so I know what I'm doing. Just to make sure I don't sort of confuse the shapes, because while it's at a sketch stage where it's very early, those lines can sort of mix up, and I want to make sure it's very clear for myself for when I do my inking. Now with that, get all the sketches, put them all in a big folder, lower the opacity down, and start on the inking. Now one thing with my inking is I like to do all mine with a fairly high smooth brush and just one of the standard hard round brush. I won't actually add any line weight variation in my first inking pass. I'll do that as a separate thing. Now if you prefer to have variable line weight in your inking brush, great, fantastic. This is just going into how I do it and why I do it this way. So adding a bit more detail there and having a few goes at some of those shapes. Control Z, nothing wrong with that. And adding in this nice smooth lines for the face and the hair. And feathering out, so a little bit more feathering as well with the hair. And that jawline there I'm not loving, so I've redone that one and taken a bit out of it. What I thought was a wrong jawline was just I had drawn too much of it. And you can see there in the sketch, I've actually drawn the line of the jaw, but I've left it off the inking. I'm still going to define it later, but I won't be defining it with a line. I'll be defining it with the edge of a piece of tone. So I'll have a bit of shading that I'll cut the edge off very sharply, and that'll still give me that edge of the jaw, but it won't give me a black line that's going to divide the shapes up. And here I'm just doing the inking for the arms and the clothing, and I'm doing a fairly simple line for the clothing here. I wanted a fairly straightforward outfit for the first tutorial, and I'll notice those little tiny creases like under the boob there and in the waist and just there where the pelvis meets the thigh. Those little bumps can imply the texture of the clothing, because you have to imply it. You can't just sort of paint the clothing on. So you'll have just a couple of creases there just to show that it is fabric, and they'll behave differently. Like there I'll do one or two, but most of the fabric I'm going to define its texture again with edges of shading. And so then just doing the segments of the hands, because robots have segmented hands. That's one of the key features. And add a little bit of jawline there. And now lastly, I'm doing the line art for the eyes. I like to do them last as a sort of finishing touch. But again, whatever order you do them in, whatever order you feel comfortable with, is fine. A lot of people like to do them first, because if the face isn't working, the illustration it's a wash. So it can be good to do that early to know whether that needs fixing. I like to do it last just because that's how I roll. Now for inking the hair, a lot of big sweeping simple shapes are good there, and just going on to a little bit of detailing for the seam. Now even if you don't plan to do a very loose fitting bit of clothing with a lot of folds, you still want to do a bit of detailing on where the fabric seams would go. So things like leotard, they'll have these really strong seams down the center, and they'll help describe the clothing material. Even if it is really tight, it'll still have really hard sort of creases and seams that'll help show that it is fabric, and they'll give you that credibility and believability. Now with that, that's my first bit of inking. Now the next layer here, you can see on the right hand side there with my layers tab, I've made a new layer, and this one's the thickener. So this is where I add little dark bits where any of the light would be occluded. So the ambient occlusion is where even in a bright room, there are parts of an image that are so occluded, they're so hard for light to get to, you will still get little spots of dark shadow. So that's what I like to use to darken my line art. You can use a lot of different things to decide where you want your line art to be. You can do, for example, line art thickness based on lighting direction. So you can have it where the lighting is in, let's say, the top left corner, and so all of the lines that face away from the light source will be thicker, and all the line art towards the light source will be thinner. And that way you can imply that directed light, which can be good for things like simplistic manga, set in a desert. You'll see a lot of ways of showing harsh light using your line art. For me, I like to use it as an ambient occlusion pass to really show some of those really dark spots. So that's what I do. And I'll do that on a separate layer. And you'll notice through this one, every now and then I'll start flickering the main line art layer on and off. So the reason I do it on 2 layers and don't just draw my line art thickener on the same layer is that if I draw it on 2 separate layers, I can turn the proper line art layer off and on like that, and you'll see it'll show me what parts of it, like the hand you're looking at now, I hadn't actually finished. So it helps me not miss any areas of line art detailing by just flicking it on and off. Now with that, you can pop them all in their own layer, or put them in a folder. You can merge them at this point if you want. I just leave them together in a folder and move on to base coloring. Now, Clip Studio has a great bucket fill tool. It's really good. It sort of bleeds out a little bit from where the edges stop, so it won't leave that little white ridge you see in a lot of bucket filled, more amateur artworks. One thing it won't do though is it won't fill all the way to the corners of sharp points. So things like the points of the hair it won't do. And you also have to do guidelines for it, like with the eye there, where there isn't any black line art to show where the end of the white of the eye is, so I had to draw a bit in myself. Now there is a way around this. Now if you do want to use the bucket fill and have a similar effect in something like Paint Tool Sai that doesn't have a bleed function to the bucket fill, what you would do is you would do a selection with the magic wand tool, and then you would expand that selection by about 3-4 pixels, and then bucket fill that. That way you'll have a bit more bleed on your filled colors if the software you're using doesn't have that as part of the bucket fill itself. And so now you can see the green background I've put. That's a bit of an error correction for me. So what I'll do is I'll fill a layer with bright green, like just painfully bright green, and I'll put that underneath my color flats. And that shows me all the gaps. The green will show through as any gap in the flat colors. And here I'm just doing a bit of a tune of color, just because it was a bit dull colored-wise. Like it was a nice muted color scheme, but a nice muted color scheme on the foreground and a nice muted color scheme on the background will mean that there won't be anything to really pop. So I gave the character a bit more contrasting and bright color to pull it out of the background a bit. Now here you can see I've made a selection based on my flats. So I use my flats for a lot of different things. One of them I use them for is a guide layer to tell the magic wand tool where to stop and start. So the magic wand will, when told to, only take into account the flat colors. So it'll ignore the line art, it'll ignore everything else, it'll only look at the flat colors, and it'll make the selection based on that. That gives me a really easy way of isolating, like here, just the clothing layer, or when I want to move on to the skin, I can just select that and it'll select all the skin, and it helps me isolate it without having to do like separate layers with different masks. I can just use my flats as my selection guide. You can do that in Clip Studio. I know you can do it in Paint Tool Sai with things like the lighthouse or selection layer. You nominate that in the Layers tab. And so then I've moved on to doing the shading on the body. Now with simplistic shading, you'll notice this in anime and cartoons as well. Since they don't have a lot of time, they have to produce hundreds of frames of animation, they rely on the quickest and most effective way of applying tone and getting depth. Now, what that'll be is your drop shadows and surface planes. So overall, the surface of the chest is facing up, but overall, the surface of the pelvis is facing down. So I'll do the underside of the rib cage and the pelvis all in shadow, and that gives a really hard cutoff of shape. And I'll do a little bit of detailing there where the fabric's folding in, but overall, I've paid attention to where the surface plane is, whether it's facing up or whether it's not, and giving it nice big shadows, trying to simplify those shadows into big broad shapes. The other thing I'll do is try and concentrate on things like drop shadows. That would be things like underneath the head, that shadow there that falls on the chest from where the chin is, those will also really help you with a bit of depth. And also, don't be afraid to drop some pretty heavy tone. One mention on this, now you can see in the Layers tab, I made a copy of my flats. Now, flats aren't just good for guiding where your selection is. You can also use your flats layer to tell your shading layer how dark to be. So if I was just shading with, you can see the pale sort of desaturated pink, that'd work great on the pale areas like the skin, but once I took a multiply layer with a fairly light color, which will work great on light areas, onto a dark area like the clothing, it's just not going to be dark enough to really punch through. So what you can do is you can use a copy of your flats layer linked to your shading layer and set the mode on that. You can see there to brightness or luminosity, I think it's brightness. And what that'll do is it'll darken your shading the darker the color it's going over it is. So when I shade over the dark clothing, it comes out much darker. But when I shade over the skin, it comes out lighter. Now you can tune that, of course, by doing a hue and saturation adjustment, so Control U, on that flats layer you've linked to your shading layer to maybe darken it a bit, maybe lighten it a bit, and just have that control so you can have your shading all in one color, but have it come out in an appropriate color depending what you're shading on. Now here's that, and again you can see that band down the middle. Always look for opportunities to do a drop shadow. Drop shadows are great. Do them whenever you can. They should be a priority. Have a cast shadow from something out of view, like maybe they're under an awning. Also, don't be afraid to do large sections of shading, like I said before. The ponytail probably has plenty of light on it, but I want it to be separate. I want it to be further back. So I shaded most of the whole thing. Then moving on to doing a bit of detailing on the eyes. Now, these are an area where you do want to add detail. So when I said before, don't add detail everywhere, but do add detail to certain places. These are your focal points, like the eyes, the face, the hands. Anywhere where the viewer is going to be drawn to, add detail there. But other areas, let them be rest areas, like the flank, like the side of the thigh there. That's not a big detail focal point, so I'll let that be a rest area. The length of the hair, I'll let that be a rest area as well. So then the last thing you can see I did there was I added some blushes. So that's just a bit of redness to parts of the skin where the bone comes close to the surface. Now it's a robot, so not a thing, but for the purposes of how we do blushes, this is how you do it. Anywhere where the bone comes close to the surface, like the nose, the cheeks, the shoulders, the elbows, the knuckles, anything like that, the skin becomes redder. People aren't Barbie dolls. They're not one uniform color of beige plastic all over. We've got different amounts of different colors on different parts of the body. One of the most common ones is more red wherever bones come close to the surface. And then adding the last bits of the highlights there. Now the reason I do the shading, then the blushes, then the highlights, is just because some of the highlights look particularly good, like you can see there on the shoulder and cheeks, when they're put over the top of that slight darkening you get for the blushes. So it's worth doing that after, so you've got that contrast and you can see where they're going to sit. Now the other thing about adding highlights is sometimes a highlight isn't where you make something brighter. Sometimes a highlight like here on that seam down the center of the outfit is not a bit of white you've added, but a bit of shading you've taken away, because it'll have the same net result. So that's why I've added a bit of white down that seam down the center there. Not too much, just a bit of a rim to it. And then adding maybe a bit of shine to one or two spots. So here on the leg, I've done it a bit too far over to the right, so I think, yeah, that's right, I do fix that one up and just drag it over just a touch. Now that's most of the shading done. Now the next thing to do would be to, once all, and any bits I've missed, so here you can see I missed the shading on the little snail eye things. So after that, put everything you've drawn into a folder, make it a bit transparent, and you can start working in the background. Now the reason I don't just turn it off is because I want to be able to see where the figure's going to be over the top of the background. So that tells me where I should and shouldn't put all the effort in. Like if I'm drawing a lot of windows and they're a bit of a large amount of effort to go through, I won't do them under where the figure is just because it's going to be covered up anyway. So it tells me where to put my effort and where to put my shading, and also make sure that the detail isn't conflicting with the focus, which should be on your character or subject. Now if you are doing a background, different story, then you want the focus to be on them, but this one, as you can see, is primarily a character illustration. Now I'm just detailing in the brickwork here, and it's just 2 colors, one color for the bricks and another one for the brick ones. They only need to be very simple. All the background elements, I'm going to be blurring them out towards the end just to pull focus away from them. So they're not going to need to stand up some very hard scrutiny. So just some simple cracks, irregular shapes, irregular thicknesses, doing a lot of crack details around the corners, but leaving big rest areas. Now with the detailing in around the buildings here, just doing very simple shapes. These are all, like I said, they're going to be blurred out later. So nice clean building shapes. Some look good, some look a little sus. And just very simple bridges across. And again, I'm just going to fill these in with the bucket. They're going to be blurred later, so I don't have to have anything more than correct perspective and roughly the right shapes. They're the only things that really matter here. And you can see I haven't really done any detail where the character's going to fall in the middle, because again, that bit's not going to be visible, so adding detail there just isn't worth it. And then maybe adding a few little random bridge things across, just to sort of keep that shape language consistent. Now, with that, the next thing I want to do is add some sort of broad shading or lightning to the background. So I've got some reflected up light in those bricks there to show there's like light coming off the sand, because this is in a dark alley, so or the start around one. And then also some lighter shapes towards the bottom of the further background to give it atmospheric perspective. Now here I'm tuning in some of the shadows and just getting them right where I want them, just doing some fine tuning. Like I said, you can use the shading layer, the flats layer to indicate how dark they should be, but you can also use it for things like what color, or just manually tune sections of your shading layer. Now here you can see I'm adding some subsurface scattering. Now just to oversimplify it, and we will come back and make a separate video on these later, subsurface scattering is where light goes in to something, bounces around, and then comes back out, and it brings some of that color with it. So you'll see some light go in on the lit areas of skin, bounce around, and then come out in the shaded area with a bit of glow that they've picked up from the light inside the body. So here, typically you'll see it done as a sort of orangey red, because the most common subsurface scattering is inside the body, where it bounces around the blood and then comes back out. So you'll see it on the edges of hard shadows more than anywhere else. And that big flash of red there is me just linking a layer of red to my line art, just to sort of soften it a bit so it's not a hard black. Next thing I'll do is a few other post-processing things. So that would be things like getting my color temperature right. That's also things like duplicating everything onto a new layer, blurring it, using the level slider to narrow it in, and blur it just to give a bit of glow. So there's a few different things you can do, and I'll go over in depth some of these ways. So this is the one where I've cloned everything, changed the level so it's super high contrast and super dark, and then duplicated it, blurred it, put it on top, and then set it to screen and adjusted the opacity. Now, so this is the illustration we've ended up with. So thanks for watching. If you have any questions about the drawing or any part of the process, or other videos you'd like to see, or even feedback on this video, since I am, as you can probably tell, very new to video production, then please do leave a comment below. And of course, if you enjoyed the video, like, subscribe, etc. And if you want videos like it to happen more often, you can support me on Patreon. You can also follow me on the Instagram and on the TikTok, which I'll hopefully learn to use probably even very soon. The links are in the description below. You have a good day. Cheers.